Hi, welcome to Vibration Cinema, the alter destiny of film. Recently, I've been thinking about something the good sis Ruun said at the New York Film Festival 2020 panel outside the Canon.
I always have a difficult time talking about film or talking about what I do because I'm not inspired by film or filmmakers or filmmaking at all, but I'm inspired by what the camera can do and what people power can do with this technology.
With each passing day, I feel this even more. The way that cinema is discoursed is not conducive to what I want to do, so I often turn to metaphors. This channel's name obviously comes from culinary anthropology, but I want to take a look at something that has been helpful to me in conceptualizing what it is that I want to do with film. I found that fashion was a good tool that allowed me to think differently about filmmaking, because fashion, after all, is doing a lot of the same things as cinema in many respects. So when we look at a garment, we're looking at an image. The print, silhouette, materials, colors, accessories, and styling, etc. And as a model walks it down the runway, that image moves. And back when models could actually, walk, we got a little performance. And of course, a collection has many of these garment images which come down the runway in a very specific order. And if you look at Nick Cave's work, the performance of his suits moves in a way which produces sound. So we have the synergy between image, motion, performance, collation, and sound, the basic DNAs of cinema. The purpose isn't to draw comparison between these mediums, but to use these commonalities to defamiliarize my understanding of cinema to gain new insights and perspectives on how to conceptualize movies. The expressive power of any given film technique is abstract, especially if it isn't explicating narrative information, but so too is any garment. But in context and conversation with other movie techniques or how a look is styled with accessories, ideas are revealed. After all, if in our personal style we can express our interests, personality, locale, culture, class, sexuality, spirituality, etc. with something as abstract as a piece of fabric, then so too can we express similar ideas cinematically. The way that most collections are put together is that a designer has a certain silhouette, certain colors, fabric materials in mind that they use to various permutations focused on a particular concept. What's productive for me is taking an idea and just playing around with it to see which ways it can be expressed visually, sonically, narratively, etc. In Orchid Boys, for example, I wanted to embody this long-distance relationship with what I called the unpresent presence. They're in the relationship presently, but not physically so. I chose techniques that I felt embodied the contradiction, reflections, crossfades, superimpositions, shadows, L-cuts, and combined them in whichever ways I could think of. And we were testing everything. Not everything made it, but we were going out there a little bit. Orchid Boys was such a creative explosion, really at the time, because I was jumping into fashion. And using couture runways as a metaphor for filmmaking opened up new creative pathways for me to explore. Once you can articulate what it is that you want to do, there's really no limit to your creativity, except for a budget. The language that I needed wasn't found in the cinematique, but instead on the runway. I started thinking about fashion in this way because of something Brad taught us in a seminar. He had us look at the Steve McQueen retrospective, Savage Beauty. At first, he talked to us about how he studies fashion books and magazines in order to understand the lighting of different fabrics. He challenged us not to use lookbooks just as mood boards, but also as guidelines to understand how designers best see their work, how they use lighting to accent their garments. He's very adamant about collaboration, and it's necessary to him to know which lighting and angles best flatter whichever silhouettes or fabrics in a scene so the costume designer gets some shine. On the flip side, he told us about how on Selma he wanted slight purple undertones in the blacks, and was astonished that Ruth Carter incorporated purple threads in the black costumes. The dedication Ruth and Brad have to supporting the work of other departments is truly inspiring. Knowing so intimately how your department affects other departments, not just creatively, but also in terms of labor, working accordingly enhances your work. Mostly, I've seen departments supporting other departments, but never departments in a symbiotic relationship like this. He then asked us to look at a couple of garments from the Savage collection and talk about what they communicated to us. I remember commenting on this image and how aggressive and threatening it was, how the collar reminded me of a scythe. McQueen is a conceptual designer who shows us how much a piece of fabric can mean, so I want to talk about one of his most influential pieces, Deborah Shaw walking La Poupée. This is such a powerful image, and you see this initially out of context, and I don't know how you can think of anything but the transatlantic slave trade, but in context of the full show, it's a commentary on the cruel, restrictive nature of the fashion industry, which is ironic given McQueen is having his cake and eating it too, in basically all of his collections, this one especially. I'm not entirely convinced that this isn't a racist image, but at the same time, occasionally, racism slaps a little bit, So either way, this is an image, capital I, trademark, underlined. It's immediate, it's controversial, it's iconic, it's unforgettable. It may be a little too smart for its own good, and I would love to make such a complicated image this viscerally striking one day. Maybe a little less slavey, but with a similar pow. Also, shouts out to Mother Deborah Shaw, who walks more gracefully with her thighs restricted than a lot of the girls her caliber. Certainly better than the girls today. Like with cinema, digital technology has revolutionized fashion. Designers like Iris van Herpen 3D print their designs. Archivists like Rashida Renee and Brie Melandro have digitized a lot of important moments and unsung heroes of fashion. Graphic designers like Carlos GZZ003 take photos of celebrity and digitally redraw their looks in fantasy cosplay ways. And that brings us to animation, a particular form of kinesthetics. Anifa Mwemba used 3D modeling and animation to present her label Hanifa's latest collection over the pandemic. Because of this, she was able to safely showcase her talent as a designer. The principles of cinematic technologies translate to fashion quite nicely as well.
Taylor Swift.
Okay, great gowns, beautiful gowns.
All right, so I'm going to call this last segment Fashion Forward Coppola because I'm obnoxious and Francis is the standard. Even though he's produced prototypes in the past, Coppola started earnestly experimenting with what he calls live cinema on a project called Distant Voices in 2015 at Oklahoma City Community College and again in 2016 at UCLA. Coppola describes live cinema as...
Live cinema is when it's been conceived as cinematic, where the story is not just being told by characters speaking lines in a play, but by montage and by parallel cutting and the use of the shots and the structure of how the shots are built to achieve a result. So it's cinema. So I thought, how interesting. What if I took the technology that's available today for the modern football game, all that technology, what if we applied all of that to telling a story? In this new form of live cinema, the concept of precision is paramount, whereas it's not paramount in cinema and it's not paramount in television or live television. Why? Because in cinema, if you have something like that happen, if it's not quite precise, then you can always do take two and take three until you get one that it all has to come together. And in live television, their philosophy is to just light everything with immense amount of light from the grid, so it's just everything is illuminated. And then the cameras are just big zoom lenses, and they're following everyone around, so there's absolutely no shot. There's no concept of a shot that is precise.
I believe in the potential for fashion to achieve live cinema. After all, designers like Thierry Mugler incorporate live theatrical performances and elements of staging on their runways. Then we have Victoria's Secrets, who brought runways to television. And even though there are iconic moments, I don't think the stock shots qualify under how Coppola lays out live cinema. But this brings us to Miss Aesop Robin Rocky and her Savage Fenty show. Volume 1 played New York Film Festival on September 12, 2019, and premiered on streaming 8 days later. Given what she did on Volume 2 and 3, had the pandemic not happened, I'm convinced Rihanna would have achieved live cinema. The other thing that might be holding this back, besides a pandemic, might be some exclusivity deal with the CFDA and the timeline of when the footages can be released, or if Prime TV wanted to meddle with it in some capacity before it streams. But it's only a matter of time before she does it though. I'm not super up on fashion, so I wouldn't be surprised if a small label has achieved live cinema. If there is one, I'd love if you would let me know in the comments. But Francis Ford is not the only one with a theory of live cinema. British weirdo Peter Greenaway also talks about live cinema. His variation, called Architectonic cinema, has more to do with interactivity and moving beyond the frame, as he explains here.
And then I suggested we should make a form of architectonic cinema. We should get rid of these flat parallelograms and make of the screens themselves something that would try to contribute to the imagery on which you put it. So architectonic cinema. The means of distribution and the circumstances of architecture like this deny the possibility of us doing much about this screen. We could be like Abel Gance and invent 3 screens, if you were very lucky 5 screens, and unlike Abel Gance, we now have extraordinary technology to synchronize our projectors, a thing he certainly never did. That's why nobody for 30 years followed on with his experiments. But even the notion of multiple screens, in a sense, don't completely eradicate or change the phenomenon. So here I have a three-dimensional universe which has all sorts of metaphorical associations with our notions of space. Our first screen of many screens, remember these are all three-dimensional, was a quarter slice of the world to give us an overview. Our second screen, being Italian, was to make a screen in the shape of a triumphal arch. In order to make an embrace, should we say, of the globe as a very large space, and the horizon basically as being our determined, defining horizontal, we wanted to make a screen which represented, in a sense, the width of most of the notions of vision. And to compensate that, another screen which represented the height of the stratosphere. And then, because I had so much to say, I wanted a series of footnotes, so I added 3 more screens. All these screens are reversible. That's to say, you can see the image on the back as well as on the front. And there is one of the screens, and this, of course, is only a diagrammatic invention here. You can see the tall screen has a rather curious cutoff shape. That's because the screen itself was torqued. So it gave a certain three-dimensional notion of the actual space we were projecting on. So why don't we find a way, again, of all the particular characteristics of cinema to develop them and push them in new directions?
Liza Blunt-Moorhead has also used architectonic cinema with As of Now, in which she 3D mapped a movie about the former inhabitants of a vacant row house onto the actual structure itself. I know we're stretching the topic super thin, but as of now, I don't have plans to cover live cinema in depth, so shoehorning it into here will have to do. More relevantly, I started thinking about architecture's relationship with cinema and fashion because of Guo Pei's Couture Collection architecture. Arthur Jaffa and Ernest Dickerson both studied architecture at Howard University, and my memory and research skills have dwindled, but I know there have been a couple of major white boy DPs involved in both, but I can't seem to find them again. Either way, there is a weird relationship between cinematography and architecture that somebody should study more in depth. Fashion, architecture, and cinema are all spatial arts that depend heavily on light. And that's what interests me about this Guo Pei collection. Even though all silhouettes redefine and modify the body, here there is the metaphor for actual construction, literal body building. And with light, shadow, and a lens, you can reshape and mold the body in cinema as well. Again, veering a little bit away from fashion, I actually learned the principles of butterfly lighting through watching drag makeup tutorials.
And then the next step is gonna be highlights. So I go in here with my lovely little stick. Go everywhere, all the points of the faces you want the light. Okay, honey?
I mean, if you understand light and shadow, then you know, you can kind of look at someone's face and see what they did.
They paint the highlights and the contours of beauty lighting onto their faces. And square face queens use contour, which is basically just shadows, to round out their features. Again, we have the reconstruction of the body in fashion, which can easily translate into the lighting of cinema. So to bring it all home, in the 1992 film Bram Stoker's Dracula, Francis Ford Coppola had such a tight budget that he chose to place emphasis on the costumes instead of the set. The legendary artist Eiko Ishioka was tasked to create the looks of Dracula with the philosophy, the costumes are the set.
Francis called me up to ask me to do a costume design. I feel I'm a production designer. Then if I receive the production design work, I do a costume also, because of the costume is be a very important part of the set design. At that time, he said, Eiko, for Dracula, costume will be set. Set is going to be lighting.
I was going to lead with the costumes. I was going to put most of my money in the costumes, and I was going to diminish the sets and have the sets be more a highly imaginative use of space and shadow and like one set piece in a black void with a cloud projection.
And for Distant Vision, he inverted the relationship between the set and the camera.
We're going to work these sets to the camera. We're not going to put the camera on the set. We're going to put the set onto the camera. It's the opposite.
These were films in which Coppola had to rethink the basic principles of cinema in order to get them made. I really just want to reiterate how necessary it is to rethink our understanding of what cinema is and what it can do, and to push Ruun's point. Cinema is just stuck in the mud right now because it's so self-referential, and sometimes we need to go outside to shake things up a bit.
And it has a white refrigerator. I was like, oh, not a white refrigerator. Girl, please put your shoes on. Let's go find you a home, honey. Oh, Lord.
And that's one thing that I really admire about Coppola, is that he's constantly challenging himself in his approach to filmmaking. He's been more amenable to the changes of technology and our relationship with cinema than people who are much younger than him. He has that youthful spirit of discovery, which is so important to filmmaking. And one of the reasons why I like to toy with the idea of movie making is for the potential of new discoveries. You might stray away from the beaten path a little bit, like we did talking about architecture in a video about fashion, but you'll always find your way back. I hope as I get older, that excitement of new stays with me for as long as it has Coppola. But that's all I got for you for this episode of Vibration Cinema. Please let me know what metaphors you use to think through film in the comments below. I know poetry and music are big ones, but next up we're going to tackle film history, film historiography, so stay tuned for that. Like, share, and sub. Love you all madly. See you on the next one.